So it might seem strange to start a talk on the reasonableness of faith with a story, but I have my reasons. So here is a story told of St. Augustine. It is said that one day he was walking by the seashore, contemplating the mystery of the Holy Trinity, when he saw a little child running back and forth from the water to a spot on the seashore. And the boy was using a shell to carry water from the large ocean and pour it into a small pit that he had dug in the sand. And St. Augustine came up to him and asked him what he was doing. And the boy said, "I'm going to pour the entire ocean into this hole." "What?" said St. Augustine. "That is impossible, my dear child. The sea is so great, and the shell and the hole are so little." "That is true," said the boy. "It would be easier and quicker, though, to draw all the water out of the sea and fit it into this hole, than for you to fit the mystery of the Trinity and his divinity into your intellect. For the mystery of the Trinity is greater and larger in comparison with your intelligence than is this vast ocean in comparison with this little hole." And having said this, the child vanished. This is a wisdom summit. When we get to the summit of a mountain, the feeling of euphoria is simultaneously one of being so high and yet also of being so small. If we are wise, we will recognize that we are small, we are finite, and we are limited. And yet we have this thirst, this infinite desire in us. We climb mountains for no greater reason than wanting to see from the top. Children don't have to be taught to desire, and they certainly don't have to be taught to ask the ultimate questions. And so a first question, in our smallness, in a world so great, is it reasonable to be able to expect for us in a particular time and place to be able to understand the cause of all that is? Is it reasonable that we should expect to be able to come to such knowledge by ourselves? I suggest that it's humility which first and foremost opens us up to divine wisdom. Another story, I remember when I was in my second year of philosophy studies in Oxford as a Dominican student brother, and I was doing one of my favorite things, which is somebody else taking me out for coffee and cake. I also enjoy being taken for steak, just in case you were wondering. But anyway, I was in this coffee shop and my friend left to go to the bathroom, and this was an era before smartphones. So I did what people used to do then when somebody had left the table, which is to eavesdrop on the other conversations going on. And so as I did, I heard a group of Christians, rather to my dismay, speaking about how it was really just more important that we tell good stories. They said we should stop using reason to try and get people to come to church. We shouldn't worry so much about apologetics. Instead, they said we should tell stories that touch the heart. And for many years, I used to tell this story as a slightly arrogant Catholic. Maybe I am still a slightly arrogant Catholic, but I just tell different stories now. But I would tell this story in a certain way to denigrate a certain type of Christian who were only appealing to the emotions, and in order to say, look at us clever Dominicans who are not afraid to think. I still think we're not afraid to think, and there are some clever Dominicans. For example, Tim Church's son, Johnny. I'm not sure whether I count as one, but I'm here nonetheless. But in dismissing the power and importance of story, I was both dismissing a great deal of Christ's teaching method and also the way that some of the greatest apologists like C.S. Lewis have come into the church. Lewis had always been a great lover of myths. He thought that they contained profound truths about the human person, and eventually he became convinced that Christianity was not just a myth, but the one true myth. And so in any account of faith and reason, I think it's really, really important not to forget the explanatory power of story. Not to forget that many people believe because the Christian story simply made sense of their experience of life. They don't believe because they have examined the evidence of the reliability of the gospel accounts of Christ in great detail. But that is not to say that we cannot do the latter or that we shouldn't. Just that we will be aware that the reasons that we give for why we believe and why we actually believe, the reasons that the atheist says they do not believe and why they actually do not believe, that these reasons might not completely converge. We are not as rational as we like to make out. And being wise, I think, is to realize that I do not live my life on the level of pure reason. Being wise involves taking into account all the other influences on me. To take one example, suppose someone stopped going to church during COVID, and now they are completely out of the habit. Do you suppose that they will say, I no longer go to church because I can't really be bothered, I got a bit lazy during COVID, and now it's just all a bit too much to get myself out of bed on a Sunday morning? Or will they start to come up with a more respectable reason, like I started to have doubts about the compatibility of science and faith, or look at all the corruption. And then over time, that starts to become a believed part of their narrative for why they no longer go to church. But it's not the reason they stopped going. And so our reasons and motivations are not always as clear-cut as we think they are. One interesting thing is when you get asked to tell your vocation story, I don't know whether Father Philip has had this thing, the story changes all the time. Like the story I tell now about why I became a Dominican and the story I told about 2 years into my Dominican life are quite different. That doesn't mean that I'm lying, but I think I'm getting deeper to the motivations. And so I do want to show in this talk, having said all that, that faith is reasonable. But I also really, really want to emphasize that as Christians, we need to get better at telling stories again. Stories that speak to the whole human person and not just their intellect or not just their emotions. And so I'm going to now look at what we mean by faith. And then to close off, I'm going to look at a few reasons for faith, what are often called motives of credibility. And I'm going to examine in a little detail one of the lesser addressed ones. The first section is going to be a lot longer, so don't get scared when we're a fair way in and we're still nowhere near a sign of the second section. What then is faith? And can faith really be called knowledge? How does faith differ from opinion? Well, we'll see in this section that faith is neither opinion. It's neither my opinion that because of the home advantage and the Australians never having come up against Bazball, that England are going to win the Ashes 4-1. Nor is it, we've lost the sound there. I don't know whether that matters or you can still hear me. But nor is it the certain knowledge, say, that I will have after the Ashes when I will know the result of them. And nor is it the sort of opinion where I might say, well, we were the better team, but we won nonetheless. For those completely bamboozled by cricket references or football ones, that's the last of them in this talk. But one thing, although cricket, it should be said, somebody once said the English are not a very spiritual people, which is why they had to invent the game of cricket to give themselves a concept of eternity. But one thing that you will hear a lot of critics of faith claim is that it is just wishful thinking. They think that Christians find certain realities of the world difficult and so have simply taken on a comforting set of beliefs. Now, the first thing to say is the simple fact that my beliefs are comforting, well, that has nothing to do with whether they're true or not. And we can also say that even if some people believe for this reason, battery or? Battery. Yeah. Okay. We can also say that even if some people believe for this reason, this does not mean that belief is simply wishful thinking. if some other people believe for very good reasons. And it's also worth stating that the fact that the teachings of the church do correspond to our deepest desires to be known, to be loved, and to not ultimately perish, this correspondence is not a good argument, is not a good argument against their truth. In the same way that the fact I find a steak filling is not a good argument against its actually being nutritious and good for me, even if I know nothing of its nutritional value. You can see I've dropped steaks in twice so far. I gave a homily a little while ago, and actually I was preaching about fasting, but I spoke about the little Lindor chocolate balls. And I realized the next week that people do listen to my homilies, just not all of them, because there was a whole load of Lindor chocolate balls appeared. So the next week I thought I'd tell the parishioners about my love for steak, and some Argentinians invited me round. So just always keep dropping those seeds. But the question about our beliefs is, and always should be, are they true? But having raised the issue of wishful thinking, I think it is worth looking at C.S. Lewis's argument from desire very briefly. He's not the only one to have it, but I always like the way C.S. Lewis puts things. And so he says, on the basis that all my other desires can find fulfillment in the world, he writes, if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. In short, unfulfilled, seemingly transcendent desires point to fulfillment in another realm. But going back to belief and simple wishful thinking, faith differs from wishful thinking in that I do not simply hope that the resurrection happened. There are grounds for my thinking that it happened. But it's also true that faith differs from certain knowledge in a scientific way, in that there is no slam dunk proof that the resurrection happened. We get something of the nature of faith, I think, in that as believers, we think that perhaps whilst we cannot certainly prove what we believe, nor could anyone certainly disprove it. For example, whatever objection somebody raised to the resurrection having actually occurred, my belief is that there would be some proper response to this. We think we could say, for example, when someone says that perhaps the disciples were simply sad and thought that Jesus' spirit lived on amongst them, we could point to the fact that the scriptural accounts show that they did not think he was just spiritually there, but that he ate with them and invited Thomas to put his hands in his wounds. We can point to how differently the disciples lived after the resurrection and say that people don't undergo such a change of behavior on the back of simple wishful thinking. But when we hold something by faith, even though it is not the same as holding it exclusively by rational argument, it is not holding it for no reason whatsoever. And this is why, again, we care if somebody raises an objection to the faith. If we held it for no reason whatsoever, then objections to the faith would make no difference to us whatsoever. So faith is blind in that, yes, it is about things I have not seen for myself, but it is not unthinking, which is what people generally tend to critique us when they speak of us having blind faith. I hope you would agree that if somebody claimed to know something by faith and was completely indifferent to the evidence for or against it, we wouldn't be particularly impressed, and we would not think they cared really about the truth of what they claimed to believe. But as we have said, there is also something about the nature of faith which is different to holding something through pure opinion or pure reason. Knowing by faith is a relational way of knowing, not a way of knowing based on what is exclusively presented to the senses. What do I mean by a relational way of knowing? Well, you know by faith because you trust the person who is telling you, not because what they are telling you is self-evidently true, if it was self-evidently true, you wouldn't need to know by faith. Now, in life, there are some things which we first know by faith, and then we come to know subsequently by more scientific knowledge or in a more empirically verifiable way. Say, for example, I told you that all books in Waterstones were currently half price. Now, I'm telling you this just as an example. It's not true, because if I were to think that you thought it was true and you were anything like me, that would clear this room pretty quickly as you all ran to clear up. But say I was telling you this, and I seem like a trustworthy guy. You haven't got any reason to doubt me yet. And there doesn't seem for a good reason for me to lie about this. And so you might dash out there, storm over to Waterstones. And as you dashed by your friend on the street, you might even say, "Hey, hurry, all the books in Waterstones are half price." And given that I'm trustworthy, you wouldn't even caveat it with, "I think all the books in Waterstones are half price." I nearly said Wetherspoons there, which is if all the drinks in Wetherspoons were half price, well, I'd be there as well. That's a little Freudian slip. I don't rate the steak in Wetherspoons as it happens, so don't take me there for steak. But you wouldn't bother to caveat it with, "I think they are, somebody told me that they are." You would just say, "All the books are half price." However, when you went into the shop and you actually saw all the books are now half price, you wouldn't know by faith anymore. You would no longer know because you trusted me, rather now you would see for yourself. And this is why the church actually says that we will not need faith in heaven. As St. Paul says, "For now we see through a glass darkly, but then we shall see him as he really is." We won't need to believe by faith in heaven because we will actually see God. This is what the beatific vision is. It's why faith and hope will no longer remain in heaven, only charity. So let's now be honest. Faith in human terms is a weaker form of knowing than seeing for yourself. But it is a really, really important way of knowing. And I'd suggest that most of what you know by faith, not because you have verified it for yourself. Think of all the countries you believe to exist, but which you have not visited. Think of your knowledge that Great Britain is an island, even though you have never circumnavigated it. Think of most of your scientific knowledge if you haven't done advanced scientific study. For example, I did science A-levels at school, but most of what I know about biology and chemistry, I know because I trusted my teachers and the textbooks. If I had gone off the back of what actually happened in the experiments whilst you're trying to put a frog in somebody's pocket and sort of, fill their pocket with alkalis, if I'd gone off the back of what had actually happened in my experiments and then given those answers in the exams, I would have failed. So most of what I know about the sciences of biology and chemistry, I know by faith. So faith might be a stronger form of knowing than simple opinion, but what we know and see with our senses is a stronger form of knowing than faith. That being the case, is it really reasonable to hold things by faith? And is it reasonable to say that, in fact, as we do about our religious faith, that I am certain about the things I hold by faith? Well, yes and yes. Firstly, because the things that make human life really worth living and really interesting are not always the things that we can observe with our own eyes. Touch, taste, or see, or smell. I always seem to forget one of the senses. I think I did 4. There's definitely 5. But they're not always the things that we can detect with our own senses. The answers to the questions which give real shape to a life, the questions of ultimate purpose and ultimate origin, these are simply not empirically verifiable, but they are the most important questions. And if we limited our lives to what we can see, then life would become very small, very trivial. And with regards to the certainty with which we can know by faith, well, this all depends upon the trustworthiness and the knowledge of the one in whom I have faith. When the person whom we trust is supremely trustworthy and knows what they are talking about, then we can actually say it would be unreasonable not to trust them. To use another example about faith, think about vaccines during COVID. Oh, there you go. Might stoke a hornet's nest here. That was an argument about faith. Should we trust the scientists? Should we trust the government? People were saying, follow the science. But actually it was a matter of whether we trusted or which scientists we trusted. There were bitter arguments with some people saying, you're mad to trust them, and a majority saying, you'd be mad not to. Now, I'm not weighing in on any side of the debate, but just saying that what was characterized as a scientific debate was in fact a debate about faith. It was a debate about who do you trust. Another example, we can think of somebody in a relationship, somebody married, who keeps on saying, I just don't believe that my wife loves me, when everything in fact points to the fact that she does, and she has never given him any reason to think otherwise. Here we would not tell the man, yes, you're right to be suspicious, always keep an eye out. Rather, if we were a good friend, we would tell him he was being unreasonable, and his lack of trust, his lack of faith in his wife was actually crippling him and stymieing his ability to be able to love. Nonetheless, he could actually be correct, even though he was unreasonable in his belief that he was correct. Now, we don't tend to use the word faith of things that we know in human relations. More often we say trust. But hopefully on the back of what I've said, we can see how there is a human faith which is at work in the everyday of our life. But now I want to turn to religious faith. When we speak of faith in the religious sense, we are speaking of God's communication to us of his nature and of his love for us. God's communication of his plan for us and of his saving us. And the fullness of this self-revelation of God and his love and his mercy is to be found in the person of Jesus Christ, he who is most worthy of trust above all other people. Christian faith is faith in Jesus as God and in his church. And we can see here there's a difference between what we know by faith and the way by which we know it. So what we know by faith, the objects of the articles of the creed, well, we know them first because we trust the one who has told us. So the relationship is primary. Where the one telling us what we are being asked to take on faith is God, it is both unreasonable for us not to believe, and we can also be certain of what is revealed to us because there is no doubting God's knowledge. Where we believe because it is God who is revealing certain truths to us, we have moved from human faith to divine faith. When we believe God is speaking to us, we are unreasonable in not believing, however difficult or surprising or challenging the revelation is. If I say something utterly bizarre to you, not being God and therefore not knowing everything, and not being completely trustworthy, you might have reason to question what I was telling you. If I told you, contrary to what others think, donuts are an essential part of any weight loss program, you would think, well, he's not a nutritionist and he's not exactly skinny. I think I'll pass on that advice. But when God is the revealer, and sadly he didn't say donuts were an essential part of a weight loss program, but when God is the revealer, I do not judge what he says to be true on its initial plausibility to me. Rather, I judge it to be true simply because he has revealed it. And then I might seek to use my reason to understand better how it is true. And that's one of the main works of theology, using our human reason to understand what God has revealed. Now, there are many, many people who claim to have divine faith, but in fact they only have human faith. because they dismiss those parts of God's revelation which they find difficult or unwelcome, and they only trust in what seems true to them. I have been one of these people at a point in the past. But to believe on this basis is not to have the theological virtue of faith. Rather, it is to be constantly submitting God's revelation to my judgment, and therefore to make a God of myself, or to remake God in my own image. And the notion of conscience is regularly abused to do just this. The big question we get to now then is, has God spoken? To whom? When? And did the people who he spoke to record it right? The great difficulty in making the act of divine faith lies in determining when and where God has spoken. Now, the Judeo-Christian understanding of God speaking to us is that God does not appear directly to everyone. Rather, he speaks to mankind through intermediaries who are entrusted with a divine mission of being the instruments of God's revelation. I should say before we go further, some call this special revelation and also speak of a more general revelation such as beauty, order, purpose in the world, i.e. God made visible in the universe by his effects. And this is what some would call the God that's discoverable to the philosophers, the God of the philosophers. But I'm concerned right now with special revelation. Now, special revelation includes some of the knowledge that we could come to by reason alone, but it also contains knowledge that we could never have known by ourselves. In the same way that if a person does not speak, no matter how much I look at them, I can only know a fraction of what there is to know about them. To know the interior life of God, to know about the Trinity, we were reliant on his first speaking. Who then are the intermediaries that God has spoken through, and how and why can I trust them? Well, these intermediaries are the prophets in the Old Testament, the apostles and the evangelists in the New, and the magisterium of the church, and above all, the humanity of Jesus Christ. However, when God speaks through intermediaries, it must be possible for us to recognize that they truly have a divine commission. Otherwise, it would be extremely imprudent for us to believe, because then we could be deceived by any charlatan or any honestly deluded person into believing that whatever they claimed was revealed to them by God. Therefore, prophets, apostles, and the Word incarnate must come equipped with divine credentials, or what we call motives of credibility. We need to have a reason to believe them, but the criteria for believing them is not so much the plausibility of what they say as their own personal credibility. We believe it because they have said it, not because we judge for ourselves the truth of what they are saying. Motives of credibility are supernatural signs that manifest the miraculous action of God above natural causes. Their purpose is to show that an alleged revelation from God is truly his word and not that of a false prophet. And these motives allow us to make the transition from human faith in the word of a prophet to divine faith in the God who speaks through the prophet. Proportionate motives of credibility make the act of faith both reasonable and also morally compelling. Because, as we've said earlier, with sufficient motives of credibility, it becomes unreasonable not to believe. Without such motives, though, it is unreasonable to believe. Belief in an alleged revelation that is not supported by sufficient reasons to think that God is its source would put you in danger of attributing mere human words and claims to God. And that's a very bad and dangerous thing to do as well. It's not imploring you to be more gullible as Christians. It's why whenever somebody tells me of a private revelation they've had of God speaking to them, I am initially wary and would want to know of reasons why I should believe them, and would be seeking stronger reasons than "I told you so." This is not to attribute bad faith to the person telling me. It's just that there are so many ways we can be mistaken about such things. Another thing, when talking about motives of credibility, it must always be recognized that God's grace aids our intellect in recognizing the motives of credibility. Our recognizing what is true and good is not our work alone. And this helps us understand why, when presented with the same motives of credibility, the will of some will be moved by love to make an act of faith, and others will remain unbelievers. The opening of the letter to the Romans speaks about this, and we can think about it ourselves. Somebody who is living chastely versus somebody who is living a promiscuous life is more likely to be disposed to believe in God and all that this demands. So too, we can see how the honest man is more likely than the thief to believe, and the repentant thief more likely to believe than the unrepentant. So the best preparation for discerning the motives of credibility is prayer combined with historical inquiry. To show the divine origin of the revelation received by God's people, Israel, and his church, there are three principal miraculous signs. First, the miracles worked by the prophets, Christ, and the apostles. Second, the prophecies about the Messiah and the church. And thirdly, the very existence of the Catholic Church, in that it can be seen to be something more than a merely human society because of its universal spread, continuity, and holiness. A fourth motive is the supernatural beauty and wisdom of the revelation itself and of the person of Christ, in whom revelation culminates. The Catechism of the Church, quoting Vatican I, speaks of the first three motives of credibility as follows. Thus, the miracles of Christ and the saints, prophecies, the Church's growth and holiness, and her fruitfulness and stability are the most certain signs of divine revelation adapted to the intelligence of all. They are motives of credibility which show that the assent of faith is by no means a blind impulse of the mind. I just want now, in the time that remains, and we'll be much briefer now, to examine one of the three principal motives of credibility, which is prophecy in the Old Testament. And I do this for three reasons. First, because I think it's neglected. Second, because it makes a person more likely to take the scriptures seriously. And that is something which many non-believers refuse to do. They just see the scriptures as being made up, seeing them as purely human works. And also, it gets us looking at the Old Testament much more, which far too many Christians are rather ignorant of and therefore misunderstand Jesus, the church, and Judaism. Now, a really, really good treatment of prophecy is given by Lawrence Feingold, who I've drawn upon in this talk, and I've benefited hugely from his work. But I want to share with you a clever example given by a man called D. James Kennedy, and it's taken from the Apologetics Study Bible, which is a Bible that I find really, really helpful. And he gives the following account. He says, "Some time ago, I had the opportunity to speak to a man who had no belief whatsoever in the scriptures as any sort of divine revelation from God. He was a writer who was articulate and well educated. While he was well read, he was completely ignorant of any evidence for the truthfulness of the Christian faith and the scriptures which reveal it. He said the Bible was just a book written by men, just like any other book. I said to him, 'That's very interesting. I would like to read some statements to you about someone and have you tell me assuredly without question about whom I am reading. He agreed, and I began to read. Those who hate me without cause are more numerous than the hairs of my head. The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers conspire together against the Lord and his anointed one. Even my friend in whom I trusted, one who ate my bread, has raised his heel against me. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. They are striking the judge of Israel on the cheek with a rock. My God, why have you abandoned me? Instead, they gave me gall for my food, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are disjointed. My heart is like wax, melting within me. Yet he himself bore our sickness, and he carried our pains. But we in turn regarded him stricken, struck down by God and afflicted. He willingly submitted to death. He bore the sins of many and interceded for the rebels. Now, there's a lot more other verses there. But Kennedy said to the friend, he said to him, "About whom did I just read?" And the friend replied, "Well, you obviously read of the life and ministry and suffering and death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth." And Kennedy said to him, "Is there any question in your mind about that?" And he answered, No, there is no one else that could refer to." And Kennedy replied, "Well then, I would want you to understand that all of the scriptures I just read to you are taken from the Old Testament, which was completed some 400 years before Jesus was born. No critic, no atheist, no agnostic has ever once claimed that any one of those writings was written after his birth. In fact, they were translated from Hebrew into Greek in Alexandria some 150 years before he was born. If this is merely a book written by men, would you please explain to me how these words were written?" He said, "I haven't the faintest idea." He was completely nonplussed. He had never heard those things before in his life. But they cannot be explained by any purely humanistic presuppositions. And Kennedy closes by saying, "It is noteworthy that in no other religious writings in the world do we find any specific predictive prophecies like we find in the scriptures. You will find no predictive prophecies whatsoever in the writings of Buddha, Confucius, Muhammad, Lao Tse, or Hinduism. Yet in the scripture, there are well over 2,000 prophecies, most of which have already been fulfilled. I do not think it is unreasonable to believe."